I thought it was just another weekend, some peace and quiet, maybe a little hunting like I'd done a dozen times before on my own land. But then a letter showed up from the HOA, claiming I'd violated some obscure rule buried deep in the community guidelines. At first, I laughed it off. I mean, how could they tell me what I can and can't do on my own property? But the tone of the letter wasn't friendly. It mentioned fines, legal action, and something about a clause in the deed I didn't even know existed. Turns out, this wasn't just about hunting. This was about control, about a hidden trap written into the fine print of a contract I'd signed years ago without a second glance. I started digging into paperwork, into the history of the HOA, into neighbors' stories, and what I found was worse than I expected. This wasn't the first time they pulled something like this. What started as a simple citation turned into a full-blown battle, and the deeper I went, the more it felt like I wasn't just defending my land. I was stepping into something much bigger, something that had been waiting for someone like me to trigger it. And the worst part, I had no idea how far they'd go to enforce it. It all started when I bought the property 3 years ago. Tucked away at the edge of a wooded cul-de-sac, it felt like the perfect mix of freedom and peace. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors polite, but mostly kept to themselves. I skimmed through the paperwork, signed the deed, and figured that was it. Nobody mentioned anything about restrictions on hunting, and definitely not the strange clause buried in the HOA agreement under something called land use continuity. Sounded harmless enough at the time. Fast forward to this fall, I set up a small ground blind on the back edge of my lot, well within my own tree line. No signs, no warnings, nothing. But within 48 hours of my first outing, that letter showed up. No warning, no knock on the door, just an envelope taped to my front porch, typed up like a court document. It claimed I had violated Section 5B3, a clause saying any activity resembling game tracking or wildlife pursuit was strictly prohibited on HOA-managed land, including privately owned lots. I reached out to the HOA board for clarity, but the response was ice cold. They quoted the rule, restated the fine, and hinted that any further non-compliance could result in escalated legal action. That's when I started noticing things. Cars idling near my driveway, neighbors suddenly avoiding eye contact. I started digging into that clause, Section 5B3, and what I found didn't sit right. The language was vague, but deliberately so, full of legal phrasing that gave the HOA broad power over environmental disruptions. The kicker: my land was technically inside a conservation overlay zone managed by the HOA, something I never noticed because it was buried in a separate section of the deed, pages deep in tiny print. The real shock came when I talked to an older neighbor, Tom. He'd lived there since the beginning and warned me, "You're not the first to run into this. They don't like people shaking the roots." Tom told me about another homeowner a few years back who tried to build a greenhouse. The HOA hit him with a similar violation, then suddenly his permit got pulled, and within months he sold the house and disappeared. No one talks about it now, but Tom remembered. That's when I realized this wasn't just a hunting violation. This was about control, and maybe even intimidation. Even weirder, I found out that one of the HOA board members, a guy named Kenneth, had real estate ties and often bought up homes after owners voluntarily left. I started wondering, was this all part of a bigger pattern? I tried asking questions, but the more I pushed, the colder the neighborhood felt. And that's when the anonymous note showed up in my mailbox. The anonymous note was short and unsettling. No name, just a few words scrawled on a plain piece of paper. Watch your step. Some traps aren't obvious. At first, I thought it was a prank, but after what I'd uncovered, it felt like a warning. Suddenly, every creak outside my window, every unexpected knock on my door, made my skin crawl. I started keeping records, pictures of the hunting blinds, copies of letters, texts with the HOA, even notes on who came by and when. But the more I tried to stand my ground, the more I felt the walls closing in. One morning, I found the gate to the wooded area behind my house chained shut with a sign that read, "No trespassing, private property." That was strange, considering it was technically my land too. I decided to confront Kenneth during the next HOA meeting. He was calm, polished, almost too smooth as he defended the rules. He claimed the hunting violation was just the tip of the iceberg, a necessary step to preserve the neighborhood's value and environment. But behind his polite tone, I caught a flicker of something darker. Then, late one night, I heard movement outside, footsteps near the back fence, shadows shifting. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding. Whatever this trap was, I was stuck in it now. And the question was, how far would they go to make sure I stayed caught? Just when I thought I had a handle on things, the second twist hit me like a punch to the gut. While reviewing old community records, I managed to get through a contact. I uncovered something shocking. The deed itself contained a hidden clause that went beyond the usual HOA restrictions. It was called a reversionary interest, and it meant that if any homeowner violated certain rules, like hunting or unauthorized land use, ownership of that portion of the land could automatically revert back to the HOA. No legal battle needed. It was a trap buried deep in the fine print, something no one ever warned me about. That meant my hunting violation wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It could trigger the HOA to seize part of my property without me having any say. Suddenly, the stakes were way higher than I thought. The quiet little neighborhood with its friendly mask was actually a minefield, and I was standing right in the middle of it. As I wrestled with this revelation, the HOA ramped up pressure. Fines doubled overnight, and Kenneth's messages became more frequent, hinting at consequences for continued non-compliance. My neighbors, once distant, now seemed divided, some quietly siding with the board, others giving subtle looks of sympathy but afraid to speak out. And then, in the middle of the night, I caught movement on my security camera, someone digging near the property line. It wasn't just about rules anymore. This was a battle for control, and I was running out of time. I knew I had to act fast before the HOA could use that reversion clause against me. I hired a real estate attorney to dig through every detail of the deed and HOA rules. Together, we discovered something incredible. The reversion clause, while scary, wasn't ironclad. There were loopholes and procedural mistakes the HOA had made that could void their claim. It gave me a fighting chance. Armed with this, I confronted Kenneth at the next board meeting, laying out the facts and threatening legal action. The room was tense. For the first time, the polished mask cracked. Kenneth stammered, and some board members shifted uncomfortably. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone to push back this hard. But just when I thought I was winning, the final twist came. The attorney found out that the conservation overlay wasn't just about environmental rules. It was tied to a state-level grant the HOA received. If they lost the fight over the hunting violation, they risked losing that funding, which explained their aggressive tactics. Suddenly, the battle wasn't just about me. It was about money, power, and a system designed to keep control at any cost. Armed with this, I confronted Kenneth at the next board meeting, laying out the facts and threatening legal action. The room was tense. For the first time, the polished mask cracked. Kenneth stammered, and some board members shifted uncomfortably. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone to push back this hard. But just when I thought I was winning, the final twist came. The attorney found out that the conservation overlay wasn't just about environmental rules. It was tied to a state-level grant the HOA received. If they lost the fight over the hunting violation, they risked losing that funding, which explained their aggressive tactics. Suddenly, the battle wasn't just about me. It was about money, power, and a system designed to keep control at any cost. In the end, I managed to negotiate a settlement that allowed me to keep my land and even hunt within strict guidelines. But as I packed up my gear that evening, I realized the neighborhood wasn't the peaceful refuge I once thought. The real trap wasn't the deed or the HOA. It was how far some people would go to protect their own interests, even if it meant burying the truth beneath layers of silence. After weeks of tension, back-and-forth emails, and sleepless nights, things finally started to settle down. The settlement wasn't perfect. I had to agree to some new restrictions on hunting and land use, but at least I kept my property and my rights. It felt like a small victory after everything I'd been through. The HOA dropped the fines, and the threatening letters stopped. But more than that, I gained something I hadn't expected: a clearer understanding of what it means to stand up for yourself when the odds feel stacked against you. Looking back, the whole experience was a wake-up call. I'd always thought that buying land meant freedom, doing what you want within reason. But with HOAs, and especially with hidden clauses like the reversionary interest, there can be traps lurking in the fine print that most people never even see. It taught me to read carefully, ask questions, and not ignore the small details. Those tiny words buried in legal documents can hold big consequences. I also realized how important it is to have allies. Tom, the neighbor who warned me, was invaluable. Even some of the neighbors who seemed quiet or indifferent turned out to be watching, and a few even reached out privately to share their own concerns. Sometimes the system can feel isolating, but there are people who understand and want to help if you're willing to listen. Most of all, this story reminded me that power structures like HOAs often operate behind the scenes, quietly shaping what feels like private life. It's easy to feel powerless, but knowledge and persistence can turn the tide. For anyone facing something similar, don't be afraid to push back, get legal advice, and connect with your community. It might not be easy, but it's worth fighting for your rights and your home. So now, as I look out over my property, hunting gear packed away but ready when the time's right, I know this fight isn't just about a violation or a deed. It's about standing firm when you're challenged, and knowing that sometimes the biggest traps aren't the ones you see, but the ones you refuse to step into.